it was. Well, my friends, I say this to you. Yes, things might have been worse. But on the other hand, remember that things might have been a whole lot better.
The nation is in difficulty. Not permanent difficulties. Temporary. Surely temporary.
Wir haben nun in Paris und London und New York
It takes something of an effort of the imagination to see this desolate landscape for what it once was, the very heart of the old Victorian world economic system. This is the Albert Dock in the port of Liverpool. You have to imagine it as it was 100 years ago, crowded with ships from all over the world. Liverpool grew rich importing sugar from the West Indies, palm oil from West Africa, cotton from the Mississippi Delta, all paid for with exports of Lancashire cotton and coal. The whole system was financed, to the great profit of Liverpool shipowners and London bankers and merchants, by a single world financial system, the gold standard. For over 100 years, that system allowed this city to enjoy a golden age. Then, 50 years ago, Liverpool suffered terribly from the collapse of the old system, when the Great Depression forced Britain off the gold standard. It suffered terribly, too, from Hitler's bombers in the war that was a direct consequence of that depression. Since the war, there have been years of relative prosperity, the years of the Mersey Beat, high-rise council housing, new industrial estates, in what now looks a poignant interval of hope. Because now, once again, the docks are almost idle. And so Liverpool, where in a manner of speaking the story of world trade began, makes a good place to ask whether the current recession could degenerate into another great worldwide depression, whether in fact it could all happen all over again. To see whether it could, we have to look back to see why the last depression was so severe, why it lasted so long, and why the government was unable to do anything about it. In 1921, unemployment passed the 1 million mark. It was to remain above 1 million for almost 20 years. Depression hit hardest in the regions that depended on exports for their prosperity. Lancashire, Clydeside, the North East, and the valleys of South Wales had been the pride of British industry before 1914. In the 20s, they were moribund. New, more efficient industries in younger nations had captured Britain's traditional markets in textiles, coal, steel, and industrial machinery. The Conservative government of 1925 had made the exporters' problems even worse by putting the country back on the gold standard. That made British goods even more expensive in foreign markets and intensified the slump. In 1929, the voters rejected the Conservatives in favour of Ramsay MacDonald and the Labour Party. Things couldn't be any worse than they had been, the public reasoned. The public was wrong. Only 5 months later, the New York stock market collapsed in the famous Wall Street crash. As the entire world was engulfed in the Great Depression, Britain's exports fell lower and lower, and unemployment rose higher still. The disastrous balance of payments pushed Britain off the gold standard in September 1931. But now even the lower exchange rate couldn't help the economy. Britain's superior competitiveness was of no use in a world where economic contraction and financial panic were endemic. By the end of 1932, unemployment had reached 3 million, almost one worker in 4.
The nation is in trouble. The nation is in difficulties. Not permanent trouble and not permanent difficulties. Temporary, purely temporary. And we must establish by our action here, and you must establish by the demonstration you are going to give on Tuesday the 27th of this month, we both must establish an international confidence in our rectitude, in our honesty, in our honor, and in our determination to put ourselves in a position that no country in the world can challenge.
The fear of being pushed off gold had driven MacDonald in August 1931 to invite Conservatives and Liberals into an emergency national coalition government dedicated to saving the gold standard. When, only a month later, the pound was pushed off gold, MacDonald thought the country was on the brink of disaster. He was terrified that the pound's value might fall to nothing, Britain's credit collapse, and the imports the country so desperately needed to buy become impossibly expensive.
I hold in my hand an envelope of a letter posted in Berlin and sent to England at the time when German credit was smashed. You will observe that the postage stamps upon it amount to the colossal figure of 80,000 million marks, a sum which was once equal to 4,000 million pounds sterling. That is the result of a smash of the credit of a country.
There was, however, an economist who denied altogether that going off the gold standard was a crisis.
There's no danger of the exchange falling too far. There's no danger of a serious rise in the cost of living. The worst I should expect would be a return to the prices of some 2 years ago. But meanwhile, British trade will have received an enormous stimulus, much more than most of us have yet realized. It is a wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage where they have been pining their hearts out all these years.
Keynes urged the government to take advantage of freedom from the constraints of the gold standard and embark on a program of economic expansion. He reiterated with new vigor ideas he'd put forward in the 1920s. He urged the government to increase employment through a policy of massive public spending, financed by deliberate budget deficits. Professor Joan Robinson was a student of Keynes at the time.
Keynes says we ought to spend money on digging holes in the ground and filling them again. But of course it would be much better to spend them on sensible and good things. And Keynes was always advocating they should be spent on sensible and good things. But it would be better to spend it on digging holes in the ground than doing nothing. Because if you're digging holes in the ground, you're giving people money which they will spend on bread and boots. And the output of bread and boots will rise because there's a commercial outlet for it. That's the essential, simple point. But this leads, you see, if you follow that line of thought, it leads to a rather radical conclusion. It means that the government ought to take a great deal more concern than it does in how the economy operates.
But the national government would have none of this. They believed budget deficits would shake confidence. Economy, saving, and austerity were the keys to restoring confidence and prosperity. But more pragmatically, aggressive, radical policies like those of Keynes didn't suit this coalition of the old hands of politics. Their fundamental creed was essentially to do as little as possible in the hope that the crisis they barely understood would pass. In 1931, Sir Josiah Stamp expressed the government's views on economics, and perhaps revealed as well the clarity of their thought.
A few words about saving. Saving seems to be a very prosaic subject. Spending is so much more exciting. It satisfies the urge of curiosity, whereas saving requires self-denial, going without something that you'd very much like, at any rate at the moment. But spending seems to you to be much the better thing because you can see that it makes the wheels of the world go round. It's good for trade. But saving, well, it seems so quiet and unexciting. As a matter of fact, saving is just as good for the trade of the world, and all that view about spending being good for trade is really wrong in the long run. Now, of course, I know it's quite true that saving isn't very good for trade if it's merely saving in a stocking or in a teapot, the old style. But whenever you save £1 in a national savings certificate, or in the savings bank, or in the building society, or the numerous other ways in which money is saved, well, it goes straight into the great money machine.
Throughout the whole weary span of the British Depression, from the late 1920s until the outbreak of the Second World War, this prescription of Keynes's was on offer. Keynes and his followers, like Professor Robinson and many other brilliant economists here in Cambridge and elsewhere, worked out his analysis in even greater detail. Their ideas were eventually to revolutionize economic thought. They also provided tools with which governments, for 20 years after the Second World War, seemed at last able to end the destructive cycles of boom and bust. But in the 1930s, the British government ignored the prescriptions from Cambridge. Keynes was a prophet without honor in his own country until well after the war had begun. The Conservatives had their own remedy for the Depression: protectionism. They claimed that keeping out foreign imports would benefit both capital and labor at home. In the spring of 1932, they put an average 25% tariff on manufactured imports. On some commodities, it was as high as 50%. With the home market secure, the national government turned next to the markets of the empire. Imperial preference, as the policy was called, hoped to make of the empire an island of prosperity in a world of depression. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Neville Chamberlain, was trying to put into practice his father, Joe Chamberlain's imperialist dreams of 30 years earlier. The heads of government of all the British dominions met in Ottawa in Canada in July 1932. The British government hoped to guarantee empire markets for British exporters by getting the dominions to put up tariffs against the rest of the world. In return, the dominions would get privileged access to Britain for their raw materials and food exports.
Thursday, February the 4th, 1932, was the day on which Great Britain took the historic decision and began the great changeover. She abandoned her system of free imports in order to regain her own freedom. Freedom to control her own markets. Freedom to give her own people a chance. Freedom to treat her kinsmen and her fellow subjects overseas a little better than she treats anybody else. In the meantime, we are going to let the produce of the colonies come into our market free. And we're not going to ask the dominions to pay any tax until we've had an opportunity of having a talk with them about the whole subject at Ottawa. And we're doing this because the people of the colonies and the people of the dominions are the best customers that we have today for the goods we want to sell. And therefore, the more that we can help them, the more we are going ultimately to benefit ourselves. Now, if I can put in one sentence what we believe this great scheme of ours is going to do, I would say it's going to bring new hope to the hearts of our own people, and it's going to lay a new foundation for a united empire.
The Lord President of the Council has kindly suggested that Mr. Neville Chamberlain should sign the agreement between the United Kingdom and Canada.
The conference failed. Imperial preference as a viable economic policy had died with its first generation of advocates. In the 1930s, it was an anachronism. Dominions like Canada and Australia were far more interested in nurturing their own manufacturing industries than in selling more wheat or mutton to Britain. The British Empire, as a self-contained economic unit, was a thing of the past. So despite the grand rhetoric in Ottawa, imperial preference was nothing more than a euphemism for British isolation. But it did do some good for Britain. The tariffs made foreign goods so expensive that British producers could afford to invest in new mass production techniques. Protection gave them a breathing space to become more competitive. The steel industry made a rapid recovery under the shelter of a 33% tariff. By 1937, production was 20% above the pre-depression levels. In 1934, a new steelworks was opened at Corby in Northamptonshire. By 1936, it employed 4,000 men, many of them recruited from the depressed steel towns of Scotland. The car industry, too, profited from the tariff. Between 1930 and 1938, the number of cars on British roads rose by 60%. Protection and mass production not only cut the cost of the family car, they changed the pattern of life. As early as 1933, a housing boom began, especially in the suburbs of London and Birmingham. Miles and miles of trim streets were built as hundreds of thousands of people moved in for the first time to a home of their own. But the houses, the industrial estates, and the underground stations of outer London were no more than a glimpse of the future. All the building and the expansion made little more than a small dent on the problem of unemployment. The numbers on the dole didn't fall below 2 million until the middle of 1935, and then they fell only very slowly. They stuck at well over 1 million until 1939. Even in London, unemployment continued to be a serious problem, while in the industrial regions of the north, it persisted at disastrously high levels. The problem was that Britain's industry was still geared to exports, and exports remained in the doldrums as the entire world languished in depression. If the government seriously wanted to build up the home market to replace dying export markets, a much more aggressive policy than protection was needed. Either Keynes's public spending or something even more daring. But the country's leading moderates, MacDonald and Baldwin, would have no truck with radical ideas. They pointed to success stories like Corby, and they played down the problem of unemployment. Just as it ignored the unemployment problem, the national government took a head-in-the-sand attitude towards the international consequences of its economic policies. When Britain was forced off the gold standard, the rest of the world was understanding and prepared to live with Britain's sudden competitive advantage. But when Britain then rushed into the full-scale protection policy, only 5 months later, that was the signal that the entire international economic system had broken down. Every country scrambled for an advantage over its neighbors, with tariffs and competitive currency devaluation. Those few countries which refrained from tariffs, like Germany and the United States, were especially hard hit. They had to cut imports to sustain their balance of payments, and that meant squeezing their people's wages in the hope that with less money to spend, they'd buy fewer imports. This was truly, in Keynes's words, the economics of the madhouse, with each country competing to make itself poorer so that it could sell more exports to its neighbors. All countries sank deeper into depression. Inevitably, this rebounded on Britain. The depressed regions suffered most of all.
The queues at the Labour Exchange were half a mile long, and you had to queue up in the Labour Exchange. And when you got to the counter, the clerk asked you, "Done any work since you signed last?" That was his usual greeting. Because at that time there was a bit of casual labour with the docks. The Rossi dock was there. And there was a bit of casual labour because they were unloading ships, red lead, coal, iron ore, you name it. They were unloading at Rossi dock. So the casual labour sometimes were taken from the lads on the brow. And this is a strange thing because the dock men had badge men, and all the dock labourers with the badges were started first unloading the ships. and then there were a few tickets left for the casual men. And there would be hundreds of casual men waiting. I was small, I was physically strong, but I was small, you know, and I couldn't compete with the big guys in the rush because they threw the tickets up in the air and they landed down. And a lot of people were trampling in your hands, a lot of people injured trying to get these tickets. That was how bad it was. See? And of course, if you entered into that, Malay took a chance of getting injured. I never entered into it because I had no chance, you know.
So the means test, they had inspectors that used to go around and they'd go from house to house where people were unemployed, but perhaps a son like myself or a daughter was working and bringing an income in. Well, in those days, to be quite frank, because of the very low income and because of the deduction that was made if one started work by through the parents' unemployment benefit, it was very rarely reported that a son or daughter was working. And I remember one day, and I worked in the colliery. I started working in the colliery at just over 14, and coming home from work, having my bath, and we used to bath. In those days, we had no bathrooms. It was only the elite had the bathrooms. We used to bath in a tin bath in front of the fire, and I was bathing the top half, and a knock come at the door, and they were saying, "Mrs. Donovan, get Gerald out, get him into next door. The inspector's on the way around, the means testing inspector's on the way around. He's in Mrs. So-and-so's house at the present moment." And they were very lucky to get their boy out. So get Jerry out, as they called me, and put him over the wall into Mrs. So-and-so's house. And this is the kind of thing that happened.
The housing conditions were terrible. Toilets, 7, 3 or 4 families, and things of that description. There was a sort of more solidarity among the people then, in the sense that they helped each other more then. The food conditions were terrible. For instance, corn and mutton were a common meal. Corn and mutton. And it was very cheap then. That and herring. These were the cheapest things that were going about at that time. And they weren't being properly fed. There was a big spirit of militancy amongst the workers. And I would say the conditions in Glasgow were really deplorable.
The Great Depression then inflicted immense hardship and heartbreak on millions of people in Britain. As we've seen, it had an even more brutal impact in Germany and in the United States. In fact, after the New York Stock Exchange crashed in the autumn of 1929, a tidal wave of depression engulfed the entire world economy. No place in Britain better testifies to that catastrophe than this great trading port of Liverpool, where the docks fell silent as demand for our exports slumped and our ailing industries cut back on their imports of raw materials. Tragic though its consequences were for Europe and for America, the Depression had a truly devastating effect on those countries that produced raw materials for the industrialized world. As demand weakened, the price of vital commodities like rubber, tin, and copper fell to a fraction of what they'd been in the 1920s. The fall in prices wrecked the finances of these poor countries that depended on selling raw materials or crops. They'd gone heavily into debt in the boom years to modernize and increase production. When prices fell and their incomes shrank, they could no longer pay the money back, and they made their peoples even poorer than they were in the attempt. The suffering in these poor countries was even greater than in Wigan or the German Ruhr. Even in good times, the growing populations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America had existed at lower standards than the working class of the industrial countries. For millions in China, depression meant a desperate struggle to survive. Some of these countries were colonies of the European powers, like British India, French Africa, or the Dutch East Indies. Others were colonies in all but name, and so their suffering was re-imported back to the industrial world. The poor countries had always been an important market for Lancashire cotton, German machines, American trucks. Now they could no longer afford to buy high-priced imports. and the collapse of those markets further reduced the level of economic activity in the industrial countries. The consequences of worldwide depression were at least as important as what was happening in the United States, or Germany, or Britain. In the colonial territories, depression helped to destroy the myth of Western invincibility, and so contributed to the independence movement, which in the late 1940s swept the colonial empires away. In the independent Third World countries, democracy came under strains too great for the political system to bear. In Argentina, for example, the collapse of the world price of beef and grain led to the dictatorship of Perón. More important, the world economic crisis led to the fall of the constitutional regime in Japan, the one country outside the European world that had successfully started on the road to industrialization. It was replaced by a military regime that meant to find economic salvation for the Japanese homeland by annexing captive markets in China. Eventually, their dream was to build what they called a Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, in reality, a Japanese economic empire. So in the Far East, as in Europe, the Depression led directly to dictatorship, imperialism, and war. And it was the conflict in the Far East, not the struggle in Europe, that brought the United States into the war after the Japanese attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Doctor Win the War, in Roosevelt's catchphrase, finally ended the Depression. After the war, Maynard Keynes's ideas were accepted everywhere, not least in the United States, as a sort of handbook that could teach governments how to run the economy so that never again would depression spread so much misery and plunge the world into another war. But in time, as we shall see in a moment, governments and their advisors discovered that Keynes's ideas were no magic talisman. Now, once again, most of the world is in a deep recession. We can no longer afford to sleep secure in the knowledge that we've banished the terrors of boom and slump. We must face up to the question whether a Great Depression could happen again. Can it happen again? Could the world ever again find itself not just in a recession, but in the profound economic calamity and despair in which it lived from 1929 until the outbreak of the Second World War? For more than 30 years after the war, people thought they knew the answer to that question. They believed the answer was no. The spectre of depression had been exorcised by the wisdom shown in this house in the summer of 1944. After the First World War, the victorious Allies met in Paris to make the world safe for democracy, as the American President Woodrow Wilson put it. At Versailles, they imposed a treaty on the defeated Germans that did just the opposite. As we've seen, the decision to impose crippling reparations on Germany left the German economy dangerously dependent on foreign loans. When those loans were pulled out, the German economy collapsed. The other failure at Versailles was that the Allies did nothing to replace the preeminence of the City of London in the world's financial system, a leadership which the British economy could no longer support. The United States ought to have taken over Britain's role as leader of the world economic system then, in 1919. In a sense, the Great Depression, from which the United States suffered as much as anyone, was the consequence of that failure. But during the Second World War, at least, the United States had learnt that lesson. Britain and the United States together agreed to lay down the foundations of a new world economic order that would prevent depression and war. The political component of that job of planning the post-war world was done here in this beautiful private mansion in Washington called Dumbarton Oaks, where in 1919 the United States turned its back on the world community and rejected the treaty its president had signed. Now, in 1944, the Americans were eager for the splendors and the miseries of world power. At a subsequent meeting at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, they spelled out the shape of the post-war economic system. and the dominant intellectual influence there was the man who'd first pointed out the catastrophic economic consequences of Versailles, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes proposed the creation of a new international system of fixed exchange rates between currencies. America, as the world's richest nation, would provide the foundation of the system, the dollar. The value of all currencies was to be fixed in terms of the dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold at the rate of $35 an ounce. The purpose of the regime of fixed exchange rates was to eliminate the wild fluctuations between currencies which prolonged the depression throughout the 1930s. To enable countries to maintain the fixed exchange rates, a new world financial institution was created at Bretton Woods. This was to be known as the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF's job was to act as a lender of last resort. In other words, to bail out any country in balance of payments difficulties, while enabling them to keep to their dollar exchange rate. In effect, the IMF would give a country a breathing space in which it could sort out its economic problems without resorting to selfish, nationalist solutions which only exported unemployment to its neighbors. But once the war was over, it was immediately obvious that devastated Europe was going to need far more aid than the IMF alone could provide. The United States didn't shrink from the responsibilities of its new role as the leader of the Western world. Through emergency famine relief, through the Anglo-American loan, and finally through the Marshall Plan, America poured billions of dollars into European recovery. The Europeans used those dollars not only to purchase goods from America, but to buy and sell goods to each other as their economies got back to health. The dollar became the accepted medium of exchange between nations, as Martin Mayer explained in his book, The Fate of the Dollar.
If they wanted gold for the dollar, the United States government, under the terms of the Bretton Woods Agreement, stood ready to sell gold for dollars at a fixed price. If you held dollars, you could get interest on it. There was every reason for countries to hold dollars for the commodities that they would want to purchase and for their own trade back and forth with each other. To keep denominating the trade in Dutch guilders and German marks when the mark came, and British pounds and French francs and all of that, it was much simpler to have all of these things denominated in dollars and then make the transition to a national currency when you got back into your own country. This worked extremely well as a way to promote world trade, as a way to promote trade within Europe, the development of the so-called European Payments Union in the 1950s, which was based on a contribution of dollars in Marshall Plan aid. All of this greased the wheels of commerce, enabled nations to make what they made best and sell them abroad and import what they needed from abroad, all dealing with each other, not in terms of their national currencies, not in terms of gold, which was scarce, but in terms of dollars, which would have a flexible supply.
In the late 1940s and the early 1950s, Europeans were happy to hold dollars because there was always a use for them. In virtually every industry, American goods were better. They were technologically superior, cheaper, and always readily available. But Reconstruction and industrial boom, especially in Germany and Japan, meant that by the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the American lead had been eroded. Europeans were less enthusiastic about holding dollars, but still the dollars poured out. The American government spent billions on foreign aid and on military forces abroad, while American corporations bought up factories and land all over the world, and American tourists roamed the globe. European businessmen continued to borrow dollars from American banks to finance Europe's growing trade. All these dollars eventually made their way to the central banks of Europe and Japan. The central bankers saw little prospect of ever spending the mounting dollars on American goods, and so they decided to invoke the safety mechanism of gold. The Europeans had insisted at Bretton Woods that the Americans must guarantee to exchange gold for the dollar at the rate of $35 an ounce.
Eventually, the number of dollars in foreign hands was going to exceed the quantity of gold available to redeem them, and the whole American promise to redeem gold at $35 an ounce would begin to look like a fiction. as the countries got richer, as they needed more dollars for their trade, and also as they were able to build reserves, which would not be needed now but might be needed later, which would be backing for their own currencies. They then had a choice. Would they accept dollars for that purpose? And dollars were valuable dollars you got interest on. Or would they want to have gold? And when you got into the late 50s, as European prosperity increased and as their reserves built up, increasingly, the European countries began to feel they wanted the gold. The U.S. began to see in the late 50s that gold was draining out of Fort Knox. And at that point, suddenly people had to start worrying about whether the Bretton Woods system could survive.
Unfortunately, not everybody worried about the problem to the same extent. Presidents Kennedy and Johnson were more worried about the march of world communism in Cuba and Southeast Asia. The build-up of American defense spending and the Vietnam War enormously increased the dollar deficit. Year after year, the deficit in the American balance of payments went on. Successive American governments under Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson simply didn't give the health of the dollar high priority. The dollars piled up in Europe. Eventually, there were well over 100 billion of these euro dollars, as they were called, held by the banks. And very often it was the local offices of American banks in London, Zurich, Paris, and Frankfurt. That would have been all right from the American point of view. But eventually, there were so many dollars in Europe that the bankers had more than they wanted. They began to turn them into the central banks of the various European governments, who were pledged to buy them with marks and francs and pounds. This put the European governments in a quandary. If they were going to buy these billions of dollars, which private owners were now offering them, they would be paying for them in their own currency. That would mean increasing the number of marks or francs in circulation, and so stoking up inflation when those marks and francs were eventually spent. To the Europeans, the Americans, by failing to control their balance of payments deficit, were simply exporting their inflation to Europe. The Germans in particular had a horror of inflation because of their memories of 1923. So the Germans, and then the other Europeans, put their foot down. They told President Nixon that he must end the American deficit. And in August 1971, he gave in. What he did was to devalue the dollar, in the hope that by making American exports cheaper, he would improve the American balance of trade. This might have worked if Nixon had been able to control inflation. Instead, looking to the upcoming 1972 election, he allowed a boom to begin. Inflation roared out of control. Even more devalued dollars piled up, unwanted and unloved, in Europe. By February 1973, the Bretton Woods system, by which all the world's currencies were fixed to the dollar, had collapsed. From now on, exchange rates between different currencies were left to fluctuate, with all the possible consequent dangers of disruption to international investment and international trade. Richard Nixon doesn't seem to have understood the historic meaning of what had happened. In fact, when they came and told him that the Italian lira was misbehaving, he delivered one of his most memorable lines. "I don't give an expletive deleted for the lira," he said. Yet the devaluation of the dollar truly was of more than passing importance. It marked the end of the long and on the whole remarkably prosperous period when the international economy was regulated by the order established here at Dumbarton Oaks and later at Bretton Woods. From now on, you could say, the United States was a country like all the others. It could no longer act as the lender of last resort to any country in trouble. In future, every American administration, like every British government, would have to take account of what the world's foreign exchange market thought its money was worth. The Bretton Woods system, in fact, was dead, even before the world learnt to know the name of Sheikh Zaki Yamani. After the Arab-Israeli War in 1973, the Arabs decided to play the oil card. Taking a hawkish line in the oil cartel OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they quadrupled the price of crude oil. The price shot up from $3 to $12 a barrel. This was a more shattering blow to the oil-importing countries than anything that had happened since 1945. Almost overnight, countries in the industrialized world, as well as in the third world, had to find billions of dollars to meet their spiraling energy costs. The United States was hit as hard as anybody else. She was in no position to repeat her generosity of the 1940s and 1950s, when she'd financed the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. Nor was the IMF or any other international agency wealthy enough to play the role of lender of last resort. The only people with the financial muscle to help countries with oil payments problems were now the Arabs themselves. As novices in high finance, they refused to lend directly and long-term to countries in such economic difficulties. They opted instead for a cautious investment policy, putting most of their spare billions on short-term deposit with private international banks in Europe and the United States. It was these banks that stepped into the breach. They lent the money to third world countries which needed it, and at a very fat profit to themselves. By 1981, the total amount of this oil money, recycled by the banks in this way, was a staggering $650 billion. Zaire owes $4 billion. The Philippines, $8 billion. Argentina, $12 billion. South Korea, $16 billion. Turkey's debt is $18 billion. Poland, $25 billion. And the biggest debtor of all, Brazil, owes over $60 billion. There are many differences between the world of the 1930s and the world of the 1980s. But without wanting to be alarmist, it's as well to recognize that there are also certain ominous parallels. The Great Depression grew out of a recession. Today, again, the world's been in recession for 7 lean years. The Great Depression happened because of an excessive accumulation of debt. Today, again, the world is dangerously encumbered with debt. In the 1930s, the debtors were in Germany, Central Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Today, Germany is a massive creditor, but countries like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Poland, Turkey, and Korea have run up huge debts to pay for oil. The Depression of the 1930s was triggered off by a financial panic. Could such a panic be generated again, so that the whole downward spiral into catastrophe could be repeated? The financial crisis which set off the 1929 Depression took the form of what the economists call debt deflation. That means that people and businesses had taken on debts in the boom years which they would have had no difficulty in paying back if prices had held up. But when prices fell as a result of the recession, they couldn't meet the payments on their debts and went bankrupt. As people desperately scrambled to sell off their assets to pay their debts, prices fell even lower. A chain of bankruptcy eventually hit the banks themselves. In the United States, something like a fifth of all banks went under. The frightening thing is that 99% of those debtors who defaulted as a result of the 1929 crash had been prudent and responsible farmers and businessmen, or bankers, before the crash. Today, the big banks in London, New York, and Frankfurt certainly look prudent and responsible enough. But the conditions are ominous in certain respects, just the same. The big banks owed hundreds of billions of dollars by the Third World, and they themselves have borrowed on the same scale, mainly from the Arabs. If anything were to happen either to those debts or to the source of their borrowing, the banks would be vulnerable. And their part in financing industry and other economic activity in every developed country is now so pivotal that if they are vulnerable, then so is the world economy as a whole. Today, the weakest link in the chain of international debt is not the Kreditanstalt Bank in Vienna or the American farmer. The weakest link is in the Third World. For example, in Brazil. Brazil earns $20 billion a year in export revenue, selling chiefly coffee, soybeans, iron ore, and sugar. But this leaves a gaping hole in her account. With oil at $35 a barrel, imports cost $24 billion. To plug that gap, Brazil has to borrow. In an effort to eliminate the deficit, Brazil's trying to increase her exports, so she's been borrowing even more to build up her export potential in industries like steel or petrochemicals. The result is that foreign debt keeps growing. Today it stands at $64 billion. Because of Brazil's difficult financial position, these debts don't come cheap. The banks charge a high interest rate, and that means annual repayments now running at $15 billion a year, only $5 billion less than Brazil's export earnings. Conditions would not have to get much worse before Brazil's borrowings would go not for capital investment, or even for oil, but simply to pay off old debts. Brazil's military government wants very much to pay off all their debts and bring the foreign accounts into balance. But not even a military dictatorship can control all the factors of economic life. The workers and the peasants of Brazil have the power seriously to disrupt the country's export revenues. Apart from any political dangers, Brazil's export earnings are crucially dependent on the world price of commodities, like coffee, soybeans, and sugar, prices that fluctuate widely. If any of these prices were to fall dramatically, Brazil would be unable to honor its debt commitments. If Brazil, or countries like Brazil, were to default, some of the major Western banks would be in deep trouble.
Suspicion develops in the community about the banks that are heavily involved in Brazil. One of the banks that was borrowing heavily in Brazil finds it very difficult to keep on borrowing in the market, and finally it can't. At that point, because it cannot borrow to repay its maturing debts, it says it can't pay its debts. At that moment, a whole batch of investors in these banks and a whole batch of banks that are involved with Brazil want out. And that starts a collapse, which, unless there is intervention, is a triggering device for a collapse of the international financial system.
Lending to the third world is half of the big bank's business, and by far the most profitable half. The other half is the financing of commerce and industry in the United States and Europe. If the banks were suddenly deprived of the stream of payments from one or more third world countries, they would lose a significant slice of their profit.
17 and 7/8.
Right, okay, 341,396 Deutschmarks.
They would also have no alternative but to cut back on their lending in the industrialized world. And this at a time when interest rates are already so high that they're choking investment. A further cut in the supply of money would drive interest rates higher still. The consequences, without exaggeration, could be called catastrophic. All the bank's customers, who depend on a constant stream of loans, would be squeezed for cash. Business, hire purchase companies, stockbrokers, local authorities would all have to scramble to find cash. They would try to unload everything they could sell to meet their obligations. Prices would collapse, profits would fall, industry would lay off millions of workers in an effort to remain solvent. The starting point might be different, but before very long, the world could be back in the same chain of events which led to the economic disaster of the 1930s. In the last 50 years, governments and bankers have learned a great deal about how to make such a disaster less likely. Hollis Chenery is Vice President of the World Bank.
Well, I don't think in the modern world there is a real likelihood of default. The last 25 years, I think in almost every case, there has been an agreement to reschedule debt rather than to have it actually in default, which means that no payments are being made on it. So that, although it's possible, the cost to the country in terms of its future credit is so great that it's not in its own interest to default. It is much better to negotiate with its creditors some adjustment in terms. And on the whole, I think it's been a remarkable performance by the private banking system. I tend to be quite favorable to the workings of the private market in coping with the increased price of oil.
What must be said, though, is that the world's economy has come to be rather frighteningly dependent on two things: on the continued flow of oil money from the Middle East, and on the continued ability of the bankers to manage the whole intricate process of pumping that money to where it's most needed. The bankers say there is no cause for alarm. They're sound and conservative men, and they see no prospect of a 1929-style financial panic. They're confident that they can rush money like sandbags to patch up the dike as soon as a breach appears. Is it unkind to remember what Keynes himself said in 1931, the last time things didn't work out quite as the bankers predicted? A sound banker, said Keynes, is alas not one who foresees danger and avoids it, but one who, when he is ruined in a conventional and orthodox way along with his fellows. We must all hope that the sound bankers do not fail this time. And of course it's true that if they were to fail, governments have built up elaborate structures to protect their people against the return of economic calamity. We know all this. We know too that the most respected economists and some of the world's most powerful bankers and industrialists are optimistic that the 7 lean years are now over, and that the dangers of another Great Depression can be averted. But then, that is exactly what they were saying, right here in Dearborn, Michigan, when Henry Ford toasted the success of American capitalism just 3 days before the bubble burst in October 1929.